The first rays of dawn stretched lazily across the countryside, spilling golden light over the rolling hills and the old farmhouse nestled in their embrace. Clara stirred briefly in her sleep as Ethan's alarm buzzed sharply at 4:30 a.m. He groaned softly, careful not to wake her, and fumbled to turn it off. As was his routine, Ethan rose before the sun to prepare for his early shift at the warehouse a few towns over. Theirs was a rhythm built over years of shared love and responsibilities. Clara, a freelance writer, often worked late into the night, while Ethan left for work when the world was still shrouded in twilight. The house was quiet, save for the gentle creak of the wooden floorboards as Ethan moved about. Their dog, Max, a shaggy golden retriever, wagged his tail sleepily from his bed near the door, but didn't rise. He, too, was accustomed to these mornings, knowing he could snooze a bit longer before Clara would wake and take him for a walk. Clara was cocooned in the soft comfort of her favorite quilt, blissfully unaware of Ethan's departure. He leaned over her before he left, brushing a kiss across her forehead and murmuring, "See you tonight." She stirred but didn't wake, a smile flickering across her face even in sleep. Outside, Ethan started the old truck, its engine coughing to life in the crisp morning air. The sound faded quickly as he drove away, leaving the farmhouse wrapped in silence once more. The house itself seemed to breathe, its old bones creaking now and then as the temperature shifted with the rising sun. Hours passed. The golden light of morning brightened into the soft brilliance of mid-morning, filtering through the windows and casting playful patterns across the wooden floors. Clara remained asleep, her dreams meandering through pleasant, nonsensical paths. Max had now moved from his bed to curl up on the rug by her side, his rhythmic breathing the only sound in the stillness of the room. The home was a charming reflection of Clara and Ethan's life together. It was modest but warm, filled with signs of their shared journey. A patchwork quilt Clara had made during their first winter in the house, framed photos of their wedding day and family vacations, and Ethan's collection of vintage tools hung proudly in the garage. On the kitchen counter, a half-full mug of Ethan's coffee still sat, his rushed breakfast routine leaving behind little reminders of his presence. Clara's bedroom was particularly serene, decorated with soft blues and whites. It carried a coastal theme that she adored, even though the nearest ocean was hours away. The vertical blinds on the window were her latest addition, their pale blue fabric matching the quilt on the bed. They were practical, too, keeping out the glare while allowing her to let in as much light as she wanted. She hadn't yet gotten around to adjusting them that morning, so they hung in a neat line, slightly parted to allow a sliver of sunshine to spill through. It was in this tranquil setting that the day's peculiar events would soon begin. But for now, Clara lay unaware, her breathing slow and steady. The world outside continued its march forward. Birds chirped merrily in the trees, a breeze stirred the tall grass in the fields, and the occasional car passed on the distant road. The farmhouse, as always, felt like a safe haven, a world apart from the hustle and bustle of life beyond the hills. This sense of peace was something Clara cherished deeply. She often thought of their home as more than just a building. It was a sanctuary, a place where life slowed down, and the chaos of the world seemed a million miles away. She and Ethan had worked hard to build this life together, and every piece of the house carried their stories. The creaky staircase was where Ethan had proposed one snowy evening, too excited to wait for a more picturesque moment. The kitchen counter was where they had spent countless hours cooking, laughing, and occasionally burning dinner. But even the safest places can harbor surprises, and Clara's farmhouse was no exception. Beneath its peaceful exterior, an invisible threat had begun to brew, one that neither she nor Ethan could have foreseen. While she slept, the dryer in the laundry room hummed relentlessly, its steady vibrations lost in the quiet hum of the house. It had been running since the early hours when Ethan, in his haste, had tossed in a load of work clothes and hurried out the door. What should have been a mundane part of their routine was quietly becoming something far more dangerous. And yet, the universe has its ways of intervening. Whether through chance, intuition, or forces beyond comprehension, Clara was about to be roused from her deep slumber, not by an alarm, but by something far more peculiar. For now, however, she remained blissfully unaware, wrapped in the peaceful cocoon of her dreams. The morning stretched on, and the stage was quietly set for the extraordinary to break through the ordinary. This chapter of Clara's life, though it began in quiet simplicity, would soon serve as a reminder of the unseen connections that thread through existence. It was a moment when the delicate balance of their lives tipped ever so slightly, setting in motion a chain of events that would leave Clara with a profound sense of wonder and a gratitude she would carry with her forever. Chapter 2. The Stirring Blinds. The sunlight had shifted, creeping steadily across the bedroom floor until it touched the edge of Clara's quilt. The golden warmth coaxed her closer to waking, but it was not the sun that ultimately pulled her from her slumber. Instead, it was a peculiar sound, a faint but rhythmic tap-tap-tap like something gently rapping against wood. Clara stirred, her brow furrowing as the sound persisted. It wasn't loud, but it was insistent, enough to nudge her from the last vestiges of her dreams. She opened her eyes slowly, adjusting to the light that filled the room. At first, everything seemed normal. The familiar contours of her bedroom, the soft rustle of Max shifting in his spot by the rug. Then she noticed it, the blinds. Two of the pale blue fabric panels in the middle of the window were moving erratically, flapping against each other as though caught in a tiny, invisible wind. The sound they made was soft yet distinct, the fabric hitting itself in a steady rhythm. The other blinds, however, hung perfectly still, their pristine lines undisturbed. Clara blinked, her sleepy mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. She propped herself up on one elbow, watching the two panels sway and collide with an energy that seemed completely out of place. The window was closed, its latch secured tightly as always. The air in the room was still. No fan hummed in the corner. No draft crept through unseen cracks. Yet these two panels moved as though stirred by something unseen, something purposeful. Her initial reaction wasn't fear, but confusion. She rubbed her eyes, half convinced she was imagining it. But when she looked again, the movement continued, just as steady and insistent as before. Her gaze flicked to the other panels, then to the edges of the window. Everything else remained untouched. Only those two panels in the center seemed to be caught in this strange dance. As the moments ticked by, Clara found herself growing more curious than alarmed. There was something almost mesmerizing about the motion, as though the blinds were trying to communicate with her. She sat up fully now, her feet touching the cool wooden floor, and watched them intently. "What in the world?" she murmured aloud, her voice breaking the silence of the room. Max lifted his head at her words, his ears perking slightly before he let out a low groan and flopped back down. Whatever was happening didn't seem to bother him. Clara glanced at the dog, half expecting him to react to the odd movement, but he remained blissfully indifferent. The tapping sound continued, steady and deliberate, as though demanding her attention. And it was working. The more Clara stared at the blinds, the stronger the feeling grew within her that this was no random occurrence. It was too specific, too focused. She couldn't explain it, but a quiet certainty took root in her mind. Someone or something was trying to tell her something. Clara stood, her curiosity pushing her past any lingering hesitation. She approached the window cautiously, her bare feet making no sound on the floor. The blinds kept moving as she drew nearer, their erratic swaying undeterred by her presence. When she was close enough to touch them, she reached out slowly, her fingers brushing against the cool fabric. Instantly, the motion stopped. The abrupt stillness startled her. She pulled her hand back, her pulse quickening slightly as she stared at the now motionless blinds. They hung in perfect silence, as though nothing had happened at all. For a moment, Clara wondered if she'd imagined the whole thing. But then she saw the faint ripple in the fabric, the subtle sway that lingered even after the movement had ceased. It was real. She was sure of it. Clara stepped back from the window, her mind racing. The blinds hadn't been moving because of wind or air currents. There was no logical explanation she could think of. And yet, she didn't feel frightened. On the contrary, a strange sense of calm had settled over her, as though an invisible hand had reassured her that everything was all right. Whatever this was, it wasn't malevolent. It felt protective. The thought gave her pause. Could it be a sign? Clara wasn't particularly superstitious, but she'd always believed in the possibility of things beyond human understanding. Her grandmother had often spoken of guardian angels and subtle messages from the universe. As a child, Clara had dismissed those stories as fanciful. But now, standing in her bedroom with the memory of the moving blinds fresh in her mind, she wondered if her grandmother might have been right. A faint sense of urgency began to creep into her chest. Whatever this was, it seemed to be trying to get her attention for a reason. Clara turned away from the window, her eyes scanning the room as though searching for an answer. Her gaze fell on the door. Without thinking, she moved toward it, driven by an inexplicable need to leave the room. The moment she opened the door, a new sensation washed over her, an acrid, almost metallic smell that made her nose wrinkle. Clara froze, her hand still on the doorknob. The scent was faint but unmistakable. Something was burning. Her heart skipped a beat as her mind raced through the possibilities. Could it be the stove? No, she hadn't cooked anything that morning. A candle left burning? She hadn't lit one in days. The smell grew stronger as she stepped into the hallway, her senses now fully alert. Clara's pulse quickened as she moved toward the stairs. The sense of calm she'd felt earlier was fading, replaced by a growing sense of urgency. Whatever had caused the blinds to move, whatever had woken her up, it had been trying to warn her. And now, she understood why. As she descended the stairs, the smell became more intense, seeping into every corner of the house. Her stomach churned with dread, but she didn't hesitate. She knew she had to find the source before it was too late. The blinds, the tapping sound, the invisible urgency, it all made sense now. Something or someone had been watching over her, guiding her toward this moment. And though Clara didn't yet know the full extent of what she was about to uncover, one thing was clear. Her quiet morning was about to become anything but ordinary. Clara's heart pounded as she descended the staircase, the faint but acrid scent of burning growing stronger with each step. Her bare feet barely made a sound against the aged wooden stairs, but her mind was anything but quiet. 1,000 thoughts raced through her head as she tried to make sense of the situation. The peculiar movement of the blinds, the tapping sound, the sudden, inexplicable urgency, none of it fit into the framework of her normal, rational world. And yet, it was all undeniably real. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, the smell became unmistakable. It was a sharp, biting odor, one that seemed to hang heavily in the air. Clara wrinkled her nose, instinctively covering her mouth with her hand as she tried to pinpoint its source. Her eyes scanned the living room, the kitchen, and the open hallway leading toward the laundry room. Everything seemed still, ordinary, untouched, and yet the smell persisted, growing stronger with every breath. "Something's wrong," she murmured aloud, as though hearing the words might make the situation clearer. Max, who had followed her down the stairs with his usual lazy gait, suddenly perked up. His ears twitched, and he sniffed the air, his tail giving a hesitant wag. Clara watched him closely, hoping his animal instincts might lead her to the source of the problem. Max let out a low, uncertain whine and padded toward the laundry room, his nose working overtime as he sniffed along the floor. Clara followed, her steps quickening now. The laundry room was at the far end of the house, a small, functional space with just enough room for the washer, dryer, and a few shelves stocked with cleaning supplies. The door was ajar, and as she approached, the smell hit her full force, a suffocating wave of heat and smoke that made her eyes water. She coughed, instinctively stepping back before pushing the door open fully. The sight that greeted her made her stomach drop. The dryer was running, its familiar hum now accompanied by an ominous clicking sound. The machine's metal casing was hot to the touch, the kind of heat that seemed to radiate outward, filling the small room with an oppressive warmth. Clara's eyes widened as she noticed the faint tendrils of smoke curling out from the edges of the dryer door. Her breath caught in her throat as a terrifying realization struck her. The clothes inside were on the verge of catching fire. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Years of growing up with a practical, no-nonsense mother had drilled a sense of level-headedness into her. She knew she had to act fast. Clara rushed to the dryer, her hand hovering over the control panel as she hesitated for a split second. Turning the machine off was the obvious first step, but she couldn't shake the fear that opening the door might unleash something worse. A burst of flame, perhaps, or a cloud of smoke that would engulf the room. "Don't overthink it," she told herself, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. With a decisive twist, she turned the dryer off. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving an almost eerie silence in its wake. The clicking noise ceased, but the oppressive heat remained. Clara grabbed a nearby towel, wrapping it around her hand before cautiously pulling the dryer door open. The sight inside made her gasp. The load of clothes, Ethan's work pants, a few towels, and a couple of shirts, was charred around the edges, their fibers singed and brittle. The intense heat had warped some of the items, leaving them shrunken and distorted. Clara reached in carefully, her towel-protected hand brushing against fabric that was still alarmingly hot to the touch. She pulled the items out one by one, tossing them onto the tiled floor to cool. A few emitted faint wisps of smoke as they landed, but no flames appeared. Clara exhaled shakily, relief washing over her like a tidal wave. She had stopped it in time, but the what-ifs lingered in her mind, chilling her to the core. What if she hadn't woken up? What if she hadn't noticed the smell? The thought of the fire spreading, of the house, the memories it held, and even her own safety being consumed, was almost too much to bear. She sat back on her heels, her eyes fixed on the dryer as her mind replayed the events of the morning. The blinds, the tapping sound, the overwhelming sense that something was urging her to act. It all pointed to one conclusion. This wasn't just a series of coincidences. Something or someone had been trying to protect her, to alert her to the danger before it was too late. Clara thought of her grandmother again, the stories she used to tell about guardian angels. "They don't always show up in the ways you expect," her grandmother had said. "Sometimes it's a feeling, a nudge, a sign you can't quite explain. But if you listen, they'll guide you." Was this what her grandmother had meant? Clara's logical mind struggled with the idea, but deep down, she felt certain. The blinds moving on their own, the rhythmic tapping that had pulled her from sleep, it wasn't random. It was deliberate, intentional, a warning given just in time. Max nudged her arm with his nose, breaking her train of thought. She looked down at him, his big brown eyes filled with concern. "It's okay, buddy," she said, scratching behind his ears. "We're okay." Clara rose to her feet, her legs trembling slightly from the adrenaline. She grabbed a broom and began sweeping up the debris on the floor, her movements mechanical as her mind continued to process what had just happened. The laundry room smelled heavily of smoke, and she made a mental note to air it out as soon as possible. For now, though, she focused on cleaning up and making sure the situation was fully under control. Once the immediate danger had passed, Clara stood in the doorway of the laundry room, staring at the now silent dryer. The sense of urgency that had gripped her earlier had dissipated, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude. She didn't know who or what had intervened, but she was thankful beyond words. As she walked back to the living room, Clara glanced toward the stairs, her gaze drifting to the bedroom where it had all started. The blinds were still now, hanging perfectly in place, as though nothing unusual had ever happened. But Clara knew better. She felt a deep certainty that she had experienced something extraordinary, a brush with the divine, or perhaps a glimpse of the unseen forces that occasionally cross into the mundane world. Clara sank onto the couch, Max curling up beside her. The adrenaline had begun to wear off, leaving her feeling drained but deeply reflective. Whatever this was, guardian angel, intuition, or something else entirely, it had saved her. And for that, she was eternally grateful. The oppressive scent of burnt fabric lingered heavily in the air, weaving its way into every corner of the house. Clara stood in the kitchen, clutching a glass of water with trembling hands. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the events of the morning, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. She couldn't seem to shake the image of the smoldering clothes tumbling endlessly inside the dryer, on the cusp of bursting into flames. Her instincts had guided her, but the thought of how close she'd come to losing everything sent chills down her spine. Every memory, every memento, every trace of the life she and Ethan had built in their little farmhouse could have been consumed by fire, all because of one overlooked moment of carelessness. She took a long sip of water, forcing herself to breathe deeply. Max padded into the kitchen, his nails clicking softly against the tile. He paused to sniff at her leg, sensing her unease, before settling at her feet. His quiet presence was a comfort, grounding her in the here and now. She reached down to scratch behind his ears, the repetitive motion helping to calm her nerves. As her heartbeat slowed, Clara's thoughts returned to the strange chain of events that had led her to the laundry room. She couldn't shake the feeling that the blinds had played a critical role, their inexplicable movement pulling her from sleep at just the right moment. The memory of the rhythmic tapping sound filled her mind, its steady beat like a clock counting down the seconds to disaster. Clara glanced toward the stairs, her gaze lingering on the hallway leading back to the bedroom. The blinds were still now, hanging motionless in the sunlight, as if the entire incident had been nothing more than a dream. But she knew better. She'd seen them, heard them, felt the unspoken urgency in their motion. It was no coincidence. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the room in soft golden hues. Clara's eyes drifted to the counter, where Ethan's half-empty coffee mug still sat from his rushed departure. The sight brought a wave of emotion crashing over her. He'd left the dryer running in his haste, a small mistake that could have had catastrophic consequences. But she couldn't bring herself to feel angry, not after what she'd just experienced. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the intervention that had saved their home, but for the life she and Ethan shared. The farmhouse wasn't just a building. It was the embodiment of their dreams, their struggles, their love. Losing it would have been devastating, but losing Ethan, or even herself, would have been unthinkable. Clara set her glass down with a quiet clink, resolve hardening in her chest. She needed to tell Ethan what had happened, to share the strange and miraculous story with him. But more than that, she needed to take steps to ensure nothing like this could happen again. The first order of business was to address the lingering danger in the laundry room. She grabbed a broom and a bucket, filling the latter with water before heading back to the laundry room. The air there was still thick with heat and smoke, though the worst of it had begun to dissipate. Clara opened the small window near the ceiling, letting in a stream of fresh air that helped to clear her mind as well as the room. The burnt clothes lay in a pile on the floor, their edges charred and brittle. Clara crouched down, inspecting each piece carefully before placing it in the bucket. The water sizzled as it met the scorched fabric, sending up faint wisps of steam. She worked methodically, her movements steady and deliberate, as if by restoring order to the room, she could restore order to her thoughts as well. When the clothes were safely submerged, Clara turned her attention to the dryer itself. Its once pristine surface was now tarnished with soot, The control panel warped slightly from the intense heat. She reached out to touch it, her fingers grazing the metal before she pulled back sharply. It was still warm to the touch, a lingering reminder of the danger it had posed. "I'll call someone to look at you," she murmured, half to herself, half to the machine. "You're not running again until I'm sure you're safe." Satisfied that she'd addressed the immediate danger, Clara carried the bucket of water and burnt clothes outside. The fresh air was a welcome relief, its crispness cutting through the haze of smoke that clung to her senses. She set the bucket down near the porch, her eyes scanning the horizon as she took a moment to breathe deeply. The rolling hills stretched out before her, their lush green surfaces kissed by the soft light of mid-morning. Birds chirped merrily in the trees, their carefree songs a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded inside the house. Clara closed her eyes, letting the gentle breeze wash over her face. For the first time that morning, she felt a sense of peace. But the calm was fleeting. As her thoughts settled, they returned to the blinds, to the inexplicable series of events that had brought her to this moment. Clara wasn't one to believe in the supernatural, at least not in a concrete way. She'd always been more inclined to trust in logic and reason, to look for practical explanations. But there was nothing logical about what had happened. The blinds had moved with purpose, their steady tapping a deliberate attempt to get her attention. It was as if the house itself had come alive, reaching out to warn her of the danger lurking just below. Or perhaps it was something greater, something unseen but deeply felt. The idea both comforted and unsettled her, a reminder of how small she was in the grand scheme of things, and yet how fiercely she was protected. Clara stood there for a long moment, her mind quiet but her heart full. She thought of her grandmother's words, the stories she'd told about guardian angels, and the subtle ways they revealed themselves. "They're always there," her grandmother had said. "You just have to pay attention." Had Clara's guardian angel been watching over her all along? Had it chosen this moment to intervene, to ensure that she and her home were safe? She didn't have the answers, but for the first time, she was open to the possibility. As she turned to head back inside, Max trotted over to her, his tail wagging lazily. Clara knelt down, wrapping her arms around the dog and burying her face in his fur. "We're okay, Max," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're okay." And for the first time since waking up, Clara truly believed it. Whatever had guided her that morning, whether it was fate, intuition, or something more divine, it had done its job. And for that, she was profoundly grateful. Clara stood in the doorway of the laundry room, her eyes scanning the aftermath of the near catastrophe. The silence of the space was unsettling, almost as if the room itself were holding its breath after the chaos. The dryer, now a silent and hulking presence, bore the scars of its overheating episode, its once smooth surface marred by soot and subtle warping. Clara could feel the residual heat radiating from it, a haunting reminder of how close disaster had come to their home. As she leaned against the doorframe, the weight of what could have happened began to settle in. Her mind replayed the moments in vivid detail, the strange tapping of the blinds, the smell of burning, the sight of the smoldering clothes inside the dryer. The realization of how narrowly she had avoided catastrophe left her feeling both shaken and profoundly grateful. She glanced over at Max, who had followed her back into the room and was now sniffing cautiously at the edge of the dryer. "Careful, buddy," she said softly, her voice still tinged with lingering adrenaline. "That thing's not safe right now." Max turned to look at her, his big brown eyes filled with concern, as if sensing the tension in the room. Clara knelt down beside him, running her fingers through his fur in an attempt to ground herself. The simple act of stroking his soft coat brought a measure of comfort, a reminder that they were both safe, that the worst had been averted. Her thoughts drifted to Ethan. He had left the dryer running before heading out, unaware of the potential danger. Clara didn't blame him. He'd been trying to help, to get a head start on the laundry before his long day at work. Still, she couldn't help but wonder how he would react when she told him what had happened. Would he feel guilty? Or would he share in her sense of awe at the strange series of events that had saved their home? Deciding that the laundry room needed some fresh air, Clara pushed open the small window above the dryer. A cool breeze swept into the space, carrying away the lingering smell of smoke and easing the oppressive heat that still clung to the walls. She stood there for a moment, letting the fresh air wash over her as she tried to process everything that had happened. Her gaze drifted to the pile of burnt clothes on the floor. They were beyond salvageable, their edges charred and their colors dulled by the intense heat. Clara crouched down, picking up a shirt that had once been one of Ethan's favorites. The fabric was stiff and brittle, crumbling slightly at the edges as she held it. A pang of sadness swept over her, not for the loss of the clothes themselves, but for what they represented. They were symbols of a routine, a life that could have been irrevocably changed in an instant. She placed the shirt back on the pile and stood up, brushing her hands on her jeans. "That's enough dwelling," she muttered to herself. "Time to do something about this." Clara grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter and searched for the number of a local appliance repair company. She knew the dryer couldn't be trusted until it had been thoroughly inspected and repaired, if it could be repaired at all. After a few rings, a cheerful voice answered, and Clara quickly explained the situation. "Sounds like the heating element might have malfunctioned," the repair technician said. "That's not uncommon with older dryers, but it's definitely dangerous. I'll have someone out to take a look first thing tomorrow." Clara thanked them and hung up, feeling a small sense of relief that help was on the way. Still, the thought of waiting another day with the dryer sitting there, a potential hazard, made her uneasy. She resolved to keep a close eye on it until the technician arrived, just in case. As she moved through the house, opening windows to let in more fresh air, Clara's mind returned to the mysterious circumstances that had led her to the laundry room in the first place. The blinds in her bedroom had stopped moving as soon as she approached them, their strange, erratic dance coming to an abrupt halt the moment she touched them. The rhythmic tapping sound had been so deliberate, so insistent, it was impossible to dismiss as mere coincidence. Clara found herself standing at the base of the staircase, her gaze drawn upward toward the bedroom. She hesitated for a moment before climbing the steps, a mix of curiosity and reverence guiding her movements. When she reached the bedroom, the blinds hung perfectly still, their pale blue fabric catching the light in a way that made them seem almost ethereal. She approached them cautiously, as though expecting them to spring to life once more. But they remained motionless, swaying only slightly in the faint breeze from the open window. Clara reached out and touched one of the panels, half expecting to feel some lingering energy, some trace of the force that had moved them earlier. But it felt like nothing more than fabric, cool, soft, and utterly ordinary. "What were you trying to tell me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Of course, the blinds didn't answer. But standing there in the quiet room, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they had been a conduit for something greater. Whether it was intuition, divine intervention, or some other unseen force. She thought of her grandmother again, of the stories she had told about guardian angels and their subtle ways of making themselves known. Clara sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The sense of urgency that had propelled her out of bed earlier was gone, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. She thought of how easily she could have ignored the tapping sound, dismissing it as a trick of the wind or her imagination. If she had, the outcome might have been very different. The realization filled her with a renewed appreciation for the fragility of life and the importance of paying attention to the little things. Whether it was a sign from a guardian angel or simply her subconscious piecing together the clues, she knew she would never look at the world the same way again. Clara leaned back on the bed, her gaze fixed on the ceiling as the morning's events played out in her mind once more. The danger had passed, the house was safe, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been part of something extraordinary. For now, all she could do was hold on to that feeling and carry it with her, a reminder that even in the midst of ordinary life, the extraordinary could find its way in. Clara remained seated on the edge of her bed, staring at the now quiet blinds. The light filtering through them bathed the room in a soft glow, a serene contrast to the turmoil she had felt just an hour ago. The house was safe, the danger averted, but the morning's events still clung to her like a persistent fog. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to what had happened, that the blinds had been more than just a random occurrence. They had been a sign, a message, a warning. Clara's thoughts drifted back to her grandmother, a woman deeply rooted in faith and the belief in unseen forces. Her grandmother had been a storyteller, weaving tales of guardian angels, miraculous interventions, and moments of divine guidance that had always left Clara wondering where the line between fiction and reality blurred. As a child, Clara had listened with wide eyes, captivated by the idea of benevolent spirits watching over them. As an adult, she had grown skeptical, grounding herself in logic and dismissing such notions as comforting folklore. But now Clara wasn't so sure. She stood and walked to the window, pulling the blinds aside to gaze out at the sprawling fields that surrounded their farmhouse. The landscape was quiet and still, the hills rolling gently into the horizon. The scene was idyllic, as if the chaos of the morning hadn't touched it. Yet, Clara couldn't help but feel that the world outside had played a role in what had transpired. As she stood there, a flash of movement caught her eye. A bird, pure white, its wings gleaming in the sunlight, darted across the sky, its flight graceful and purposeful. Clara watched as it swooped low over the fields, its feathers almost shimmering. Something about the bird felt significant, as though it were connected to the strange events of the morning. She followed its path until it disappeared into the trees at the edge of their property, leaving her with an inexplicable sense of calm. "It's just a bird," she whispered to herself, though the words felt hollow. Deep down, Clara knew it wasn't just a bird. It was a reminder, a reassurance, a sign that she wasn't alone. Clara turned away from the window and headed downstairs, where Max was waiting for her in the living room. He wagged his tail as she entered, his eyes bright and attentive. Clara sat on the couch, patting the cushion beside her. Max jumped up eagerly, settling in close and resting his head on her lap. She stroked his fur absent-mindedly, her mind still preoccupied with the morning's events. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Ethan, letting her know he had made it to work safely. Clara stared at the screen for a moment, debating whether to tell him what had happened. She didn't want to worry him, especially since there was nothing he could do from where he was. But she also felt a need to share the experience, to put it into words and make sense of it. Finally, she typed a reply. "Clara, hey, glad you got there safe. Something crazy happened this morning. Our dryer almost caught fire, but I caught it in time. I'll explain more when you get home. Love you." She hit send and set the phone back down, feeling a small sense of relief. Telling Ethan would be easier in person, but at least he'd know something had happened. She leaned back against the cushions, letting her eyes drift closed as she replayed the morning in her mind. Later that afternoon, Clara found herself back in the laundry room, determined to clean up the last remnants of the incident. The burnt clothes were gone, the dryer was unplugged, and the windows had aired out most of the smoke. Still, the room carried an energy that felt different, almost sacred. Clara moved slowly and deliberately, wiping down surfaces and sweeping the floor as if she were performing some kind of ritual. As she worked, her thoughts kept circling back to the blinds. Their movement had been so deliberate, so precise, that it was impossible to ignore. But what had moved them? Was it the wind, some unnoticed draft? Or was it something more? Clara didn't have an answer, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was the latter. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. Angels don't always appear with trumpets and golden halos. Sometimes they come as a nudge, a whisper, a feeling you can't quite explain. Maybe that's what this was, a quiet intervention, a whisper of warning from something greater than herself. Clara didn't know why she had been spared, why her home and her life had been protected, but she felt deeply grateful. After finishing in the laundry room, Clara stepped outside to the porch. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the fields. She sat on the steps, letting the cool breeze wash over her as she reflected on the day. Max trotted out after her, settling at her feet and letting out a contented sigh. As Clara stared at the horizon, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The events of the morning had shaken her, but they had also reminded her of something important. Life was fragile, and every moment mattered. The little things, the movement of blinds, the smell of smoke, the flight of a bird, had come together to form a tapestry of meaning, one that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. And then, as if to punctuate her thoughts, the white bird from earlier reappeared. It soared across the fields, its wings catching the light in a way that made it seem almost otherworldly. Clara watched as it flew closer, circling once above the farmhouse before disappearing again into the trees. She smiled, a quiet sense of wonder filling her heart. Maybe it was just a bird, or maybe it was something more, a feathered messenger, a sign that she was being watched over. Either way, Clara felt deeply, profoundly thankful. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the world in hues of gold and amber, Clara sat on the porch with Max by her side. The farmhouse behind her stood as a testament to resilience, a sanctuary that had been protected by forces she couldn't see but could feel. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she felt ready to face it, buoyed by the knowledge that she wasn't alone. For the first time in years, Clara whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, her words carried away by the breeze. Whether they reached an angel, a guardian spirit, or simply the universe itself, she didn't know. But in her heart, she believed they were heard.